Good evening, everyone. I'm gonna get straight into the slides, no time to waste. It's a pleasure to be back here. Oh, here it is. C'est bon. So let me do a 30-second recap, like they do in TV shows, so previously in Decoupling Debunked. What we've done in the first part is really lay out a conceptual framework that basically allow us not only to discuss about decoupling, but also to properly read a decoupling study, to know which number to look, and to be able to put this into context. And that's handy because today we're going to do precisely that. We're going to go through the studies that have been published since the 90s about the relation between GDP and environmental pressures. And one of the goals of today is to answer that question, is decoupling happening? So now I'm not going to let you linger in impatience until the end of the lecture. I'm going to spoil it all and tell you, is decoupling happening? Yes, a tiny bit, somewhere, sometime, but not really. That's the answer we have. And so in that lecture, hopefully by the end, we better understand why the answer is decoupling happening is both yes and no, and so complicated. But before we get into this, last week, one of you asked me about if there were different definitions of green growth. And so I've built that slide, going through my text and finding at least 6 definitions of green growth, starting from the early one of the European Commission, especially the second one, which is the one of the OECD, probably one of the most famous definition of economic growth, and the latest one, the one of the European Green New Deal. So if you take time to go through these definitions, you will see that all of them just are around the same concept, but they pick and choose sometimes different environmental pressures. So sometimes it's a let's say broader, more abstract definition of sustainability. Sometimes, as in the case of the European Green New Deal, is just resource use, which is strange. People would say, oh, resource use, but no environmental impact. Remember, I divided these two decoupling, source decoupling and sink decoupling. So here with our analytical framework, we see that actually these definitions of green growth are sometimes selective. And so that's a first aspect of critique, of course, in being able to differentiate that some forms of green growth are greener than others. So a green growth that includes both resource use and environmental impact in its decoupling is wholer, is greener than one that only includes resource use, in the same way that one that only includes resource use is greener than one that only includes, one single resource. So moving on to today's menu. I was thinking about how to structure this lecture without burying you into an ocean of numbers. So the way I've decided to do this is in 2 parts. In the first part, in the first, let's say 20 minutes, I'm going to summarize the result of the first exhaustive review of the decoupling literature. I've hinted to it last week, is the Abel and Al paper from June 2020 that you can see there on the left. I'm going to summarize it and I'm going to explain it. And then in part 2 of the lecture, in the last 20 minutes, I've picked one of the most famous decoupling study, the one from Corinne Lequeré and her colleagues from 2019 that you can see on top here. That's the one that is most cited by people who try to argue that green growth is possible and that decoupling is happening. So we're going to take that study and we're going to dissect it. We're going to dive into it and we're going to put it in context to the broader literature that we've seen in part 1, analyzing it with the conceptual apparatus that I've presented last week. You see, it all ties up together. So now let's get started with part 1. This is an important study. Remember last week when I was talking about decoupling debunked and what we tried to do in the summer of 2019, we reviewed a few hundreds quantitative studies about decoupling. What they did in this paper is reviewed the entirety of the field. So in following the methodology of a proper literature review. So they started from a sampling of 12,000 papers that they narrowed down to 835. So that's what the literature review is about. This is the decoupling literature when we're talking about English, peer-reviewed, empirical studies. That's all we have. 835 articles, and they've even decomposed more specifically in terms of analysis, because one article could conduct several analyses, for example, one between GDP and CO2 emissions, and another one between GDP and material use. So when we're talking about the scientific basis about decoupling, we have 1,157 analyses to deal with. The paper is divided into two parts. The first one on the left is just detailing the methodology of the literature review, and the one on the right is actually giving the result. These papers are not too long, so I highly encourage you to have a look at them if you want. It's not a very pleasurable read, but it's precious information. Let's note also that there's been some exclusion from that literature review, namely modeling exercises. So everything dealing with projection in the future, there's been many, and we will deal with them next week because that's about decoupling in the future. What we're dealing with today is has decoupling been happening until today. So we're only looking at empirical analysis of past trends. So they've also excluded all conceptual discussions and theoretical papers, as well as subnational studies. Then that's a shame. Because it would have been great to have such a literature review focusing on, sector-specific studies, decoupling, for example, of the automobile sectors and certain environmental pressures, and maybe, at the level of the region or the city. So there's that will be perhaps a discussion for another time. Today, we're going to focus on national level and international level. So here's how it looks. Now we're just having this picture to summarize what kind of studies we have in this literature review. So let's start with the upper left. I'm going to try to turn off this, this camera so I don't see properly the slide. Yes, great. Okay, so here we see first, and I'm going to start with the upper left, that most of the studies look at two types of environmental pressure: CO2 emissions and total primary energy. Remember from last week, I said that, decoupling ideally should involve, if we should consider it a viable macroeconomic strategy, the decoupling from a lot of environmental pressures. Problem, these have not been studied. So, for example, studies looking at decoupling GDP from biodiversity loss are just, they are all almost none. So that's the first, let's say, weakness of that body of literature, is that it has selected a few environmental pressures. The good thing, and you can see that on the upper right, is that there are more and more studies, 20% increase per year, and you can see 2005 is really the moment where the study of decoupling kicks in. This was not such a long time ago. So we have to take that into consideration. Let's go to the bottom left to see the geographic scope of these studies. Half of them are national. So just looking at one case, decoupling in France, decoupling in China, actually a lot of decoupling in China, as you can see in the middle graph showing which countries have been most studied. And the other half has to do with international cross-country analysis. And now I'm moving to the last comments on the bottom right to show, remember last week I said that it was only in 2012 that studies started to take into account consumption-based indicators. That's a problem because now 92% of these analyses use production-based indicators, which for reasons I've explained last week are not, or sometimes giving the illusion, the geographical illusion of a decoupling at the level of one country that would be exporting its pollutions elsewhere. So that's the literature we're dealing with. And here are the results. So I've picked this figure because the authors have tried to pull all the different decoupling they found in the literature and look at the numbers in the last 10 years. So what they're looking at here is what we call elasticities. Elasticities in economics is a relation between two variables. So here, for example, if growth increased by 1% in GDP plus 1, they're looking at the reaction of 5 different pressures. You can see TPES, total primary energy supply, final energy, material use, carbon emissions, greenhouse gases. So look, for example, at the blue arrow at the top right corner. In all countries, studies in that 835 articles, in all the analysis that I've looked at greenhouse gases, the average for 1% GDP growth correspond with a rise of 0.22% emissions. So we don't have absolute decoupling. Absolute decoupling would be a minus number, plus 1% GDP and minus something emissions would be absolute decoupling. Here, we may have relative decoupling, but actually greenhouse gases do not decrease. What we do see just next, and now I'm pointing to the red arrow, is the only case of absolute decoupling. So here you can see it's divided into higher income countries on the ALF on the top and lower income countries. So all the lower income countries are in high coupling situation. You see the elasticity is very low. So you have 1% growth in GDP and you have almost 1% growth in environmental pressure, sometimes even a bit more, 131, 102. In higher income, which is really the countries we want to be looking at when we are talking about degrowth and post-growth, we see that also we have positive numbers. So the only case is concerning greenhouse gases, and we see this minus 0.04%. So that's confirming what we were advancing in decoupling debunked, the fact that there are rare cases of absolute decoupling, but they're so rare in so few countries, sometimes so short term and so tiny that, you know, the word I usually use is minuscule or minuscule. I don't know how you pronounce it in English, but that's one of the results here. And when we'll go into Le Quéré studies, we'll be able to look a bit in more details, because here it's an average between many, many different studies. So it's difficult to understand how that corresponds in terms of actual emission reduction, but we'll get back to it. Here I'm going to go quickly through a few results, and this they've done themselves by, you know, putting together all numbers in the last 10 years, but they've also gone through results in looking at each different environmental pressures. I've realized now it's a lot of text. I'm going to try to summarize it into a couple of interesting insights, because the conclusions are the same that in decoupling debunked. Like basically, we have no empirical basis for showing that the kind of decoupling we would like to see happening is actually happening. What we have again is little rarities, little abnormality of absolutely decoupling countries. We have also relative decoupling in many different high income countries. But so here, let me go through a couple of these. One thing they find is a difference between studies with territorial indicators and one with footprint indicators. So often in countries that have been exporting a lot of their polluting industries, it looks like decoupling, but when we double check with footprint indicators, what looked like absolute decoupling really become either relative decoupling or just even is completely canceled. That has been the case, and we'll see it later with material footprint. When we'll look at material use, it does feel like there's been a reversal of trend, but then including the whole supply chain, we see that there's been a recoupling of material use. And another result that is important concern the numbers. So they've gone really through the numbers of each of their studies, and they conclude, and you can see that the sentence at the bottom, that the rates of decoupling are insufficient. That was one of our conditions in our analytical framework. We want rates of decoupling that are sufficient to achieve environmental targets. The conclusion of that exhaustive literature review, and that we are far from reaching that. I'm going through others, material and energy flow. They see that, you know, relative decoupling is happening with countries with intermediate economic growth. That's important, and we'll come back to it in locality studies, but very often decoupling happens in situations of low economic growth. When you have high rates of economic growth, you have low rates of decoupling, but when an economy slows down, it gets easier to decouple. You'll tell me that's an interesting result, because it's precisely what advocates of degrowth are arguing, that by reducing volumes of production and consumption, we can facilitate the decoupling, or they would not frame it as such, but we can facilitate and accelerate the reduction of environmental pressures. The second time, yes, so that's what I was arguing. The third point here is extremely interesting. So what it does say is that decoupling happens very often after a long period of accumulation. So a country, for example, is going to build up a lot of infrastructure, energy infrastructure, for example, and so importing a lot of materials is going to be well coupled. And then at some point, it's going to be able to, you know, this infrastructure is going to stabilize and is going to be able to keep producing a bit of GDP extra out of that steady state infrastructure. So when we look at it, it does look like decoupling at a moment. But what we need to take into account historically is the amount of materials and energy that have been involved in the creation of a value at a certain point. Let me get a bit more specific. You know, we cannot look at a year like 2021 and say that all the value that's been creating today, you know, depends on the resources that have been extracted in 2021. Perhaps, you know, there's a nuclear power plant in France that was built, you know, 40 years ago that is just still functioning. And or perhaps there's also, you know, any process of production extends into the future, building into infrastructure. So now we need to take this into account, because that means we cannot expect certain countries to decouple without going through this phase of accumulating a certain period of high resource use to build infrastructure. This reinforces what I've been arguing last week, which is that we should aim to reduce resource use as fast as possible in the global north in order to save resources for precisely that phase of infrastructure building in the global south in regions where needs remain unmet. Another result of the analysis, and here I'm not going to get into this because it gets pretty boring, is that the authors find that many of the studies use simplistic statistical econometric point of view, not taking into account, you know, the feedback loops between different variables and a more dynamic aspect of the interrelation between nature and the economy. When I'm reading this, what I hear is that we should be careful about the type of data that we find in this literature review, because many of this studies have been done in a very simplistic mathematical manner where you pick two variables, but then you don't look into the broader ecosystemic context of that resource extraction and the broader socio-economic concept of that economic growth. So we'll see in the part 3 of that seminar next week how we can overcome that limitations by using models and scenarios. So now let me just go through a couple of quotes from the actual paper to give you a feel of that conclusion without distorting it too much. So here's is also what we tried to show in Decoupling Debunked. Absolute decoupling is rare. What the authors show, which I find to be an interesting paradox, is that even though absolute decoupling is rare, most of the people that conduct these studies, they end up recommending, the classic repertoire of green growth policies. So even though they find, and we'll see that become very important in part 3 next week, because then we realize that, well, even though you find that somehow, almost no one has managed to achieve the decoupling we want, actually no one, then we should still be trying to achieve it. So they point out this result as being an odd thing about the decoupling literature. They also show that most of the decoupling literature is written from the perspective of green growth. So people that are, let's say, uncritical about the objective of pursuing economic growth, and they're just, they take it for granted. They're like, economic growth is always going to continue. The only thing we can try to do is to green it as much as possible. What I'm wondering when I read this is how much these results would have been different if written from a growth critical perspective, adding, the option of actually reducing the size of the economy. Decoupling because of low growth, I've pointed it. So that's going to become interesting because here we have a potential convergence with the new numbers coming from the pandemic that do confirm that, when volumes of production and consumption reduces, well, pressures reduces as well. I want to say that's pretty obvious. You have less planes flying, you're going to have, a decrease in emissions from the plane sector. But now that gives us a bit of a question we'll approach next week, which is the compatibility between green growth policies and degrowth policies. I'll come back to this. What I call the dirty past of decoupling, which we need to consider through very long-term studies, all the resources and energy that has been built up into a system, and that will be required to be built up when we have a massive infrastructure change. Today, for example, if you choose in the case of France, a big discussion between further investment in nuclear energy or in renewable energy, we need to compare the kind of like global dynamic footprint of a whole energy infrastructure system to be able to make a sustainable decision. Something I wanted to bring your attention to, last week I talked about the environmental Kuznets curve, which is this hypothesis, remember, of just environmental pressures rising, we reach peak impact, and then it decouples and goes down. The authors, they show that very often we reach a different situation in the numbers, which is the one of saturation. So, it decouples, environmental pressures increase, and then it stays there. And then perhaps you can keep increasing your GDP because, you have many economic activities that are less material than others that just come on top of that infrastructure that is already built, but the environmental pressures don't decrease. And that would be a problem and a massive limit to green growth if we realize that actually there is no downward slope to the environmental pressures. We keep saturating. That's also linked to the concept of energy addition. So we often speak of the energy transition, assuming that renewable energy comes to displace fossil fuels. But in many places, numbers show us that actually it's an energy additions. Renewable energy infrastructure come on top of already existing fossil fuel infrastructure instead of displacing it. So that will be one of the limits of green growth. That is not a quite qualitative transformation of the economy, but rather a piling up of green stuff on top of brown stuff. Here I'm highlighting the conclusions of the section 2 of Decoupling Debunked to show really that we've achieved the same result, Abel and his colleagues and my colleagues and I back in 2019, was just if we define decoupling as we did last week as that decoupling that is absolute, global, permanent, sufficiently fast and large, and I should add, equitable, then that decoupling is nowhere to be seen. It is a Loch Ness monster. We have no proof of it. Before June 2020, there was perhaps some uncertainty about it, but now with this exhaustive literature review, we know that it does not exist. So answer to the is decoupling happening or has been happening until today is no. Short answer, but there's been some forms of local relative decoupling, short-term, focusing on certain resources. So now this is how I'm answering the question. This is a no, but with specifications. But when people ask, is decoupling happening? Most of the people, they are asking, can we trust green growth? Can we continue growing our economy and both achieving, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, all of this? Answer from that literature is no. So now let's get a bit more into details by looking at one of the most respected study of Corinne Lequerret and our colleagues, published in 2019 and updated in 2021. It's a different study. They're also very short to read. Highly recommend, only a few pages. The one that really was cited a lot by pro-green growth commentators is the one on the left that showed that 18 high-income economies had managed absolute decoupling. So these 18 economies, you can see the list here, represent 28% of global emissions. And what these authors have shown is in the decade between 2005 and 2015, this country grew by a median 1.1% per year in terms of GDP. And in parallel, they decreased their CO2 emissions by 2.4% per year. So that's the result. And this was loaded by many people that were saying, oh, it's great. Look, if some countries in the world can do it, then it means all countries can do it. It means green growth is happening. And so now let's get a bit more into that study to understand if that is so and if we can regain trust in the plan of decoupling. A little refresher of all the things we will have to look at. Here, if I'm looking very quickly at Lequerret's study, you should notice that they're looking at CO2 emissions. So first, it's a bit disappointing for us because now people are using that study to show that growth can be green, but I would be like, green growth is much more than a decarbonized growth. It's growth that has no impact on soil fertility, on biodiversity loss, on the use of minerals and scarce resources, on deforestation, and any environmental pressure you can think of. So even though Lequerret and our study would show that these 18 countries have become completely carbon neutral, which we'll see is far from the case, that would still not be sufficient to, let's say, debunk the result of Abel and Al and of decoupling debunked. Then they do use and compare production-based and consumption-based indicator. So that's good. The decoupling, they do look at the level of nations with an international comparative studies, so that's good as well. We will see that they make the difference between relative and absolute, and their main result is that they claim to have found absolute decoupling. So here they specify is good. Temporary or permanent, here we have a 10-year sample, which is quite short, especially it's 2005, 2015. So it would be very interesting to see what has happened between 2015 and now, and we'll see that what they do in the second paper. And now we'll have to evaluate for the questions 6 and 7. So let's do that now. let's look into these 18 countries. You can see the decrease in CO2 emissions curves in violet. And so a median 2.4% per year. So what does that represent? Let's take the case of UK. I take UK because I don't know if you're used to read the decoupling literature, but very often UK is portrayed as the success of decoupling. So now let's take the UK. So it's decreased its emissions, consumption-based, by 2.1% per year. Absolute decoupling since GDP increased by 1.1%. But now, is that sufficient? Let's compare to the national pledge, which is, the national environmental policy in UK, which is to say that it should decrease emissions by at least 5.1% per year. And now let's look at what UK should do in order to respect the Paris Agreement. We get a number of -13. So this little exercise is just to show that the -2.1% per year that we have in UK is very, very far from the type of reduction we would want to see in order to respect the Paris Agreement, which, really to simplify, is double-digit decoupling. Double digits, two numbers, 10%, 11%. That would be something interesting. 2%, not that much. So that's one of the first results here. We find a decoupling that is very, very small. The authors write it as such. So they realize, and they use the word, fall a long way short of the deep and rapid global decarbonization of the energy system implied by the Paris Agreement. So this study has been used by advocates of green growth, but the ones that have written the studies are actually very careful in the way they frame their result. And I encourage you to read the study, and I've gotten in touch with the authors to discuss their result, and they're also very careful in using that to make the broad claim that green growth, is going to be easy and possible in the future. So let's look at something else. This is the same study, it's just a different way of showing the result than the curves. You can see the 18 countries on the left, and pay attention to the red box on the right, which represents the rates of GDP per year during that time. So you can see we find back at the bottom in bold the 1.1, which is the median. And we have on the right for each countries, how the GDP has been evolving. And just next to the GDP, you can see some of them are circled. You can see the rates of decrease in consumption measured CO2 emissions per year too. Okay, so now I've highlighted 3 countries. And what I want to show here first is that rates of GDP growth are very tiny. So here it reinforces one of the results of Abel when they show that actually countries that manage to decouple are the ones that manage to do so in a context of very low rates of economic growth. That's interesting because now people that argue for green growth say, that we can actually green growth. But if it's easier to green when there's just low growth, then it goes a bit against the argument. And especially it goes against the argument of eco-modernists that argue that we need to boost economic growth in order to accelerate the reduction of environmental pressures, so that we actually need to have high rates of economic growth so that, for example, we can invest faster into eco-innovation so that we can reach, peak impact faster and then get faster on the decoupling side. This study is showing us that actually the best of the decoupling, and remember, the best of the decoupling is tiny decoupling, we get when we have almost nothing. Look at Croatia, managed an impressive 4.2. It's not 2 digits, it's just 4.2, so it's impressive relatively, but they do so with the rates of growth of 0%. Portugal, same thing, managed 5.2%, but with actually negative 0.2% median growth in GDP over the period. Same for Spain, 4.8%, but 0.4. So here, the authors also noted they tell us, that part of that decoupling can be explained by the lower rate of GDP growth. And they say that in the case where, that growth would start up, then we could perhaps expect a weakened or reversed relation. So here, just to put into context here, we're already speaking of 18 countries out of all countries in one decade, out of all decades, that have reached minuscule rates of decoupling in situation of low growth. And, even with that findings, which are, if growth had been a bit bigger, maybe that would completely cancel the findings. And remember, we're only talking about CO2 emissions. So this is what we have as evidence, of decoupling, which personally, and that will be the main conclusions of today, I find is not much. But you'll tell me if you think differently. So now there's been another study, which I highly encourage you to read, where they've shown with broader analysis of many different countries in the world that 64 countries have managed to cut their CO2 emissions between 2016 and 19 by 0.16. You can see gigaton of carbon, but there's been alongside that 150 countries that increased their emissions. If you put together, the increase in emissions and the lowering of emissions, you realize that global emissions have continued rising. It's an interesting result because it showed that whatever we have achieved so far in terms of decoupling in high-income nation, it has not been enough to counterbalance the growth in emissions in the global south. So for me, when I read this, something else must be done. And something else is just not something else like a bit more of decoupling. Remember, that's what we have. Something else is going from 2% to 13%. And so that means in my readings and in the conclusions of decoupling debunked, adding strategies of sufficiency and sobriety to the usual green growth repertoire or efficiency policies. Let me also point that here we'll only be talking about carbon emissions, which is only one type of greenhouse gases, one type of measured greenhouse gases, which is also one form of environmental pressures. Now, here's a few tweets of every single time. On the left, for example, minerals. So I was talking about recoupling. I'll show you a graph just after this. But here we realize that when you build renewable energy infrastructure, I'm thinking, for example, of electric cars. We realize that you need more metal to build an electric car than you do to build a fossil car. Same thing as this graph shows on the left. So the average amount of minerals to build a unit of power generation of a specific power has increased with the transition to renewable energy, because these renewables require more minerals than fossil energy. So we need to take this into account as well, that we can actually decarbonize the economy very fast by boosting the building of renewable energy infrastructure, but that means we're going to recouple that economy with the use of mineral. And so here, that also the type of numbers which for me give legitimacy to the degrowth strategy, which says that we should first strive to reduce energy demand in the first place. If we can reduce energy demand, it's great because it reduces the need for building fossil infrastructure, but it also reduces the need to build renewable infrastructure. In the middle, I'm pointing to biodiversity. Unfortunately, there's not many studies looking at the link between the two, which is messy because, as you can imagine, biodiversity is very contextual and local. So looking at biodiversity loss in a country like France and comparing it to GDP is really a far stretch, two variables to look at. But anyway, it's worth pointing out to that the state of biodiversity is decreasing to quite alarming levels. So whatever we're doing, it's getting worse. So that's also a good signal, even though we perhaps cannot point that there's a specific coupling between GDP and biodiversity loss. There must be somewhere in the system, a link between our economic activity and what happens to animals and other forms of life. Same thing on the right. Here's some numbers about solid waste and its coupling, showing the graph is very tiny. Even I struggle to see it, but basically it shows that high-income countries have higher per capita emissions of municipal solid waste. So it goes again against the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis that would want to see like high-income countries actually investing in eco-innovation and at very high rates of recycling and getting to a lower per capita impact than low-income countries. What we see in this graph is that this is not the case. Why? Because the footprint and the lifestyle in high-income countries is so much larger than the one in a low-income country. So perhaps we get a better recycling, but because we emit, 3, 5, 6, 10, 15 more waste, then it gets all the efficiency efforts that we've managed to have are being canceled by the pure growth of our impact. Here's an interesting graph I found in Jason Hickel and Yorgos Kallis paper, Is Green Growth Possible?, which I also invite you to read. It's one of the few papers that reviews actually models and scenarios about green growth, which I'll be summarizing next week. What they show here is a nice graph because we see the recoupling on the right. If you see that little red circle, where we have the GDP in gray, and we have some decoupling in the beginning, relative decoupling, of course, but decoupling nonetheless. And then at some point, the black line representing material use, global material use, is getting above the global GDP line, which shows that after this point, material use is growing faster than GDP, which corresponds to what I've been showing about the high material footprint of renewable energies, but also of something else like the high material footprint of the digital economy. The digital economy is often, presented as one way of decoupling because we somehow expect that we can create a lot of value on the internet in financial services and consulting without, any real process of production, without extraction of resources. But we forget that computer and the internet need hardware, they need energy, and that requires somehow a transformation of nature at some point. And that rate is increasing, of course, as the internet increases. So we'll get back into the footprint of the internet as a case study in next week. I'm going to try to conclude, not to overpass the 45 minutes boundary, and then we can deal with the rest in questions. What I take personally from that literature review is that we should be careful about this literature in either way. We should be careful in taking this literature and showing that, decoupling is not happening at all and we should forget about it. And we should be careful about doing the opposite, showing, look, it has been happening and so therefore it will happen everywhere. We're talking about science here, so there's just always limitations in these quantitative studies. We need to be careful. This is why, and that will be my final conclusions of the whole seminar, when I take the size of being critical of decoupling, it's not only a scientific reaction to the knowledge we have, but it's also a philosophical reaction following the precautionary principle. Like, even if we had no data about either degrowth and green growth, I think theoretically we can build a stronger case for degrowth because it minimizes the potentiality of risk of harm for present and future generations. This I will argue in part 3 of the seminar. As of today, the main conclusions is no, decoupling is not happening. Many things are happening, but that's not the decoupling that we would like to see happening. It's not even close. It's, if there are different shades of green, that's the lightest shade of green, the one that is almost invisible with only one letter, is the G. maybe the R. So another claim I want to do here is when I criticize the literature, I'm not opening the door to say that we need more numbers, let's do, more analysis of decoupling. I think this is a waste of time. Now, I know it's quite paradoxical to conclude that talking about decoupling is a waste of time after having lectured about decoupling. What we're going to be talking about from now on is way more specific. We're going to look at specific sectors. We're going to look at specific policy. And that's what we should be focusing now. Here, my last message is to say, like, these very abstract studies looking at, GDP abstract indicator and a synthetic indicator of, greenhouse gases, emissions, and carbon equivalent, they are ripe with many limitations. And so, especially on the economic side, measuring somehow GDP and expecting it to be a viable indicator of prosperity of a country. So what we should limit our time is to debate this, decoupling or not decoupling, and look a bit broader into each of the sector. Where are the impact? What kind of environmental pressures? How is it linked to well-being? How is it linked to environmental pressure? I'm thinking, for example, of mobility. Our cars, buses, trams, all different modes of transportation and bikes, helping to satisfy needs linked to well-being, and what kind of environmental pressures do they have? And if we get to that smaller, more specific grain of discussion, I think we can escape the limitation of these econometric studies with synthetic indicators. So that was my a few words of to be careful. And I'm finishing advertising the rest of the seminar for next week. Just as of today, we're left at a point that is a bit awkward because we've been trying to show that no decoupling has not been happening until now. And so anyone could really come and tell you, okay, cool, but the past is never a predictor of the future. And so maybe it's not been happening until now, but maybe it's going to happen today, in 1 year, in 10 years. And so we still have one more question, which is perhaps the most important and the most difficult, is to answer, is decoupling likely to happen in the future, both in terms of empirical pragmatism, let's say, and also in theory. So it's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. And the most difficult question, could it happen in theory? What I will try to argue next week is a double no. It cannot happen both in theory and in practice. But that'll be for next week. Now I'm stopping and let's do some questions.